So shall we?
Can you just hit continue? All right. So welcome to the RSES seminar for this week. We're fortunate to be able to do partially in-person seminars, and certainly it's much nicer for the speaker to be able to do that. So please bear with us on the other end of Zoom if it's a little bit cranky, because you know, this is really worthwhile for a good interaction. First order of business is just to acknowledge that we meet today on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people, and they have an enormously long history of custodianship of this area, and so we should like to acknowledge that and acknowledge their elders, the past, present, and future. I will hand over to Dave to do the introduction of our speaker today.
Okay, thanks, Louis. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Janice, who is visiting us from the Research School of Finance, Actuarial Studies and Statistics over in CBE, where she's a senior lecturer. Now, I had written an extensive bio, but it turns out Janice is going to do that herself, so I'm not going to repeat it. But the key thing is, the reason that she's over today is because she recently won a very significant medal, which is the 2021 Moran Medal, which recognises contributions to the science of the late P.A.P. Moran, FAAFRS. And its purpose is to recognise outstanding research by scientists in one or more of the fields of applied probability, biometrics, mathematical genetics, psychometrics, and statistics. So I guess you fall into the statistics bracket of that, do you, Janice? Yeah. Anyway, yes. So Janice has been working with myself and Andrew Roberts for about 3 years now, but she's been working with earth science data for about 10 years. So that's what she's going to be talking about today. So thanks, Janice. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Dave, for the very nice introduction. So today I'm going to sort of summarize, the analysis methods that I've been looking at over the last 10 years from a statistician's perspective when I've been analysing earth science data. Yeah, so I'll start with a bit of background, because I'm obviously not your typical speaker that would come and give a seminar in your series. So by training, I'm a mathematical statistician. So I study both the theory and application of statistics. And I like to motivate my theory and methods from real world data applications. So I've been at ANU for a while. I completed my PhD in 2011 in the Mathematical Sciences Institute, and then I did a postdoc there afterwards. And I finally got a permanent job in the Research School of Finance, Actuarial Studies and Statistics in 2015. So you might ask, what am I doing in RSFAS? Because I've sort of got quite a strong maths background. Well, all the teaching at ANU has traditionally been in CBE, so that's where the jobs are. And they've recently moved all of the statisticians into RSFAS. So there's no one left in maths anymore that do statistics. So we're all in RSFAS now. So my research area is broadly, I develop new statistical analysis methods for data with complicated constraints, such as manifold value data defined on curved surfaces. So I've given a few examples of manifolds here. So the simplest case is the sphere. Then you've got the simplex. So I'll be talking about the sphere and the simplex in this talk. So the simplex is a little bit complicated because it's actually a manifold with boundary. So think about the classic ternary diagram. So you're on a hyperplane, but the components are positive. So that's what we mean by the boundary. And then shape space. So the statistical analysis of shape data is sort of quite common at the moment. There's a lot of papers in our top journals on that. So that's where you're interested in analysing the shape of objects in 2 or 3 dimensions. For example, you might be interested in looking at the shapes of tumours in X-ray images to help diagnose cancer, for example. And then another one is positive definite matrices, which crops up in finance. So that's where you're interested in exploring the variability of different stocks, maybe. And I've been quite lucky with ARC grants, and I'll be talking a little bit more about paleomagnetic statistics in the second half of the talk, where I'll describe some of the things I'm working on with Andrew and Dave. Yeah, and so in the last 10 years, most of the data applications that I've focused on involve earth science data. So I'm going to sort of try and summarize all of those. And this talk is roughly in chronological order. So I'm going to start with my PhD topic. So my PhD was on developing new statistical methods for compositional data. So that's where you've got you've got a vector in p dimensions. So you've got so that's the first component, u1, u2, and so forth. And the components are constrained to sum to 1, and we've got a boundary constraint here as well. That the components have to be non-negative. So effectively, the data consists of proportions in p categories, and usually you've observed n of these. So n is the sample size. So think of your data matrix as having n rows and p columns, and you want to somehow be able to summarize that data. So compositional data actually occurs across a wide range of scientific and business disciplines. And the most classic example is from earth science. So this is where you have geochemical compositions of specimens, such as in rocks, sediments, or soils. So the concentration of chemical elements are measured. And the major ones are usually given as weight %, and the smaller ones, or the trace elements, are given as parts per million or parts per billion. So this is compositional. So the components, for example, the weights, oxides, they sum to 100%. So they're summing to a fixed constant, 100%. So, and there's actually no information lost if you divide your percentages by 100 and convert them to proportions. Yeah, you're not losing any information. So you can convert them onto the simplex scale and sort of analyze them on the unit simplex. And then some other examples I've come across. So this example here in ecology, I was analyzing that data in my PhD. There's examples in economics. So in a recent paper, I was looking at modeling proportions that households spend on food and housing costs out of their total expenditure. There's finance applications in biology and medicine. So this is one I've recently written a paper analyzing count data from stool samples. So they actually count the different types of bacteria in your stool samples. And again, the total count is known before you collect the data. So it's a fixed constant. So again, you can just divide by that total and you've got data on this simplex. It's actually quite difficult. So it's actually quite difficult to define statistical methods which fully take these constraints into account. So I'm going to show you a couple of ways of doing that. So the classical way to analyze compositional data is to take a log ratio transformation. So this dates back to Atchison's 1982 paper. So once you take the log ratios, you're effectively transforming the space. So you're actually sort of eliminating some of these constraints, and you're effectively transforming it to a Euclidean space, a standard space, so you can sort of analyze that data using a normal distribution because it's on a standard space that we recognize. For example, the additive log ratio transformation, this is one of the most common ones that gets applied. First, you have to choose a reference category. Here it's UP, so that's my last component. It doesn't matter which one you choose. And then you're taking the logs of the ratios of those components. Or in some applications, so some of the statistical methods are actually not invariant to the choice of your reference category. So the results change depending on what value like which category you choose, like the UP here. So a more symmetric version is the centered log ratio transformation. So that gets used in certain applications as well. You can see that if you swap the order of the components, you're effectively analyzing the same sort of transformed variable. So here it's just the log of the ratios of the components to the product of all of them. And that's actually defined on the real space, but you've got the constraint that they sum to 0. So you're on a hyperplane, but that doesn't matter. You can still use the normal distribution to summarize that data. So one of the issues with the log ratio transformation is that it assumes that your data is positive. So in many of these applications, you've actually got zeros in your data. So what do you do with the zeros? Because you can't obviously take the log of a zero, it's undefined. So that's one problem. So Atchison suggested some ad hoc methods of dealing with that. Like you can combine categories together or sort of come up with a sort of complicated two-part model, or you can replace the zeros by a small positive number, but that's quite arbitrary. And the results are very sensitive to the choice of this epsilon, the small positive number that you're going to add to it. And even if you don't have zeros, like in geochemistry, most of the time you don't have zeros because you've got the trace of all elements in every sample, but you've got values very close to zero. And on the log scale, those could get magnified like by a huge amount, and that could then become an outlier. So you do have to be careful even if you don't have zeros. And then there's an interpretability issue. For example, with this centered log ratio transformation, each of the transformed variables are complicated function of all the original variables. So how do you actually interpret that? They're all sort of stuck together. So I think there's those issues with that. In any case, so the advantage of the log ratio transformation is you can use the normal distribution. So I'll just summarize how you would do that, for example. So this is just a sort of simple example. Suppose the dimension is 3. So you've got 2 log ratios and you're using the additive log ratio transformation. So you've got y1 and y2. So you've got y1 and y2 on the entire, the real space of dimension 2. So in that case, you could use the bivariate normal distribution with the probability densities given here. So you could use this distribution to summarize the data. And if you plotted it, so that would be y1 versus y2, and those are the data points. So with this, the normal distribution, it has an elliptical shape, and if you're summarizing the data with a normal distribution, well, there's 2 parameters. So you've got a mean mu. So for this data set here, the mean is at 1, 3. So the mean of the first variable is 1, and the second variable is 3. So most of the data is close to the mean. And then you've got a variance matrix, because we're in, like, it's more than one dimension. So we've got the variance of y1, the variance of y2, and you can see they're correlated. So you've got a covariance. So V is a 2x2 matrix which contains these variances and covariances. Now, the nice thing about the normal distribution is that you can easily calculate the values of these parameters or the parameter estimates from your sample. So the mean is just your sample average. So that's very easy to calculate. And again, you can use sample averages to calculate, so the sample covariance matrix to estimate the variance of your data. So yeah, so it's very easy and simple to summarize your data with that. Now, the geochemical data I'll be looking at a bit later, the dimension is quite large. So P can be the order of 50 or more. So you got 50 of these variables. So in that case, you want to use a sort of a multivariate analysis method to try and extract the signal from the data. And a common way of doing that is to do principal component analysis. So in principal component analysis, you've got this variance matrix V from the normal distribution, and you can actually decompose that in terms of eigenvectors and eigenvalues. So you can see that, so the eigenvectors gamma 1 and gamma 2, they're unit vectors. So if you look at this plot, gamma 1 is the direction of highest variability in the data there, and then gamma 2 is orthogonal to that, and that's the direction of lowest variability. And note that if the first eigenvalue is really large, so that's the variance in that direction, if that's much larger than the variance in that direction, then this linear transformation captures most of the variability in the data. So you can transform your data so in the direction of the first eigenvector, and then you're actually reducing your dimension from 2 to 1. So that's what we mean by dimension reduction, and that generalizes to higher dimensions as well. So so you're trying to reduce, like if you've got 50 variables, you're trying to reduce it down to 1 or 2 variables to try and summarize the data. So that's what you do in PCA. I'll be talking a bit more about that a little bit later. Okay, so yeah, so in my PhD, I was actually looking at the square root transformation as a way to analyze compositional data, because you've got the issue of zeros. So that was my main motivation. There's got to be another transformation we can use that accounts for zeros. So that's why I was looking at this. So the square root transformation, so if you take the square root of each component, so if you do that, so you take the square root of each component, then this sum to 1 constraint then becomes the sum of squares is equal to 1. And then you're on the surface of a hypersphere. So that's when P is equal to 3, you're just on the sphere. And then you can use distributions for directional data to model compositional data. So yeah, so this approach handles zeros because the square root of 0 is well defined. It turns out that Stevens applied this approach, so he's a statistician, and he modeled the square root transform data using a von Mises Fisher distribution. So that's the Fisher distribution when P is equal to 3. And so the Fisher distribution has 2 parameters. You've got a mean direction mu and a concentration parameter kappa. Now the problem with the Fisher distribution is that the correlation structure is restrictive. So what do I mean by that? Well, it doesn't really have enough parameters to summarize typical data sets. So for example, the normal distribution in dimension 2, it actually has 5 parameters. You've got two for the mean and 3 for the variance, because you've got the variance for this first variable, variance for the second variable, and they can be different. Whereas the Fisher distribution essentially assumes the variance is the same in all directions. You've only got 1 variance parameter, which is kappa. So that's a restricted model. So in my 2011 paper, I proposed modeling the square root transform data with the Kent distribution for directional data. So let's have a look at the Kent distributions. This is what it looks like when the dimension is 3. So this is the probability density at the top. So remember, that's the probability density for the normal. So we're doing sort of the same thing. And this is what typical samples look like if you generate random variables from that model. This is what they look like. So this plot shows you 3 different samples from 3 different Kent distributions. The nice thing about the Kent distribution is that the parameters are interpretable. So mu is the mean direction. So the arrows denote the 3 different mean directions from each of the samples. So they describe the center of the data. And then you've got gamma 2 and gamma 3. So they're actually orthogonal to mu. So they're the major and minor axes of the elliptical contours. So they're a bit like these eigenvectors when I was talking about the principal component analysis. So they're effectively the eigenvectors of the elliptical contours. So you've got pretty much the same interpretation. And then you can see that the red sample is more concentrated than the other samples. So kappa is larger for that sample. So that's the concentration. So these are the shape parameters. So kappa and beta 2 are the shape parameters. So beta 2 describes the ovalness. So when beta 2 equals 0, you get circular contours, and that's the Fisher distribution. But as beta 2 gets larger, you get more elliptical shapes. And so the nice thing about the Kent distribution also is that you can estimate these location parameters, mu, gamma 2, and gamma 3, in order to summarize your sample. You can estimate those location parameters using sample averages, a bit like what we did for the normal distribution. So those are straightforward to estimate. The one sort of issue with the Kent distribution is that the normalizing factor, so this constant, this C of kappa beta, that's a function of the kappas and the beta, and it's not available in closed form. It sort of involves integrals over the sphere, and it's quite complicated. So that makes estimation difficult. However, there are some accurate approximations out there, and one is given in my paper here, So you can estimate the parameters and you can summarize the data with that distribution. Yeah, so that's what I proposed, square root transformation, then use the Kent distribution. So that was essentially my PhD in summary. So after this point, I decided to attend a compositional data analysis workshop in Spain because I thought it might be nice to meet some other people looking at these kinds of problems. So I presented my paper based on my PhD, and it was actually not well received at all. I remember distinctly after my talk, someone coming up to me, they said, "You are very brave to come here." And John Atchison was actually at the conference too. So he's the log ratio person who wrote this paper in 1982. And note that his paper and my paper were published in the same journal. So I knew my method was okay. It was in one of really quite a good journal. So he was a little bit wary. So I thought, what is going on? So unbeknown to me, I'd actually reopened Pandora's box. So it turns out Watson and Phillip and Stanley proposed a similar method for compositional data based on analyzing directions. And those papers were published in the Mathematical Geology Journal. And this journal published, so it sort of started from Watson and Phillip. They published a heated exchange between Atchison and all opponents to log ratios. So these were opponents to the log ratios. And so there was letter after letter to the editor, and it was all very aggressive and like not some of the language was not nice. In any case, it was the arguments were mainly between so this is D.F. Watson. I think he was in the Department of Geology and Geophysics at Sydney Uni at the time. So yeah, so he was sort of fighting with Atchison. So this exchange of letters eventually led John Atchison to propose the principles of compositional data analysis, which were essentially a set of mathematical properties that he said all compositional data analysis methods have to satisfy. So if your method doesn't satisfy these mathematical properties, then it's no good. You can't apply that to data. So this was quite frustrating because my second paper for my PhD took 8 years to publish because it kept getting sent to the coda work people as statisticians associated with that conference and the Mathematical Geology Journal. In any case, my PhD advisor, Alan Welsh, and we decided to have a closer look at these principles. And in this paper, which we published in the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Statistics, we show that the principles are not actually even satisfied by log ratios. So that was quite interesting. In any case, this conference had a significant impact on my work over the next 5 years or so. I met Eric Grunsky at this conference. So he was a geochemist at the Geological Survey of Canada at the time. And I also met Michael Tzagris. I'll talk more about Michael later. But Eric, so Watson, Phillip, and Stanley were some of Eric's sort of friends and colleagues. And he recognized that perhaps it was time to look at the square root transformation approach again. And Eric also introduced me to Patrice de Caratat at Geoscience Australia, who's a geochemist as well. And both of them have sent me geochemical data, and they were interested in the question, does the square root transformation work for geochemical data? Well, the short answer is no, but not because of the principles that Atchison came up with. So let's have a look at geochemical surveys. So geochemical surveys are carried out to explore the composition of rocks, specimens like rocks, sediments, or soils collected at geographically dispersed sites. And then we measure the concentration of chemical elements. So you can convert your data to proportions. And usually you've got dimension 50 or more, and the sample sizes are quite large. The elements are typically skewed and contain outliers, so you've got to sort of take that into account in the analysis. The primary goal here is to try to identify geochemical patterns and to relate these to geological processes. So I'm just going to show you an example where I analysed the National Geochemical Survey of Australia data. And just for demonstrative purposes, we're just going to look at the major oxides. So the dimension's actually 11, because we have these 10 oxides, and then we calculate a residual, which is the difference between the sum of these and 1. So the dimension's 11. So this is a map of the Geochemical Survey sampled sites. So they've gone out to all these sites in black, red, and blue, and they've taken sediment samples. So this was completed in 2011. Don't worry about the weights. That was just something coming out of my analysis. Yeah, so we've collected data from these sites. And then to analyze the data, so this is published in our 2015 paper. So Patrice is, that's the data. So he's from Geoscience Australia. Eric Brunsky's from Canada. So Michael Tzagris was another person I met at the Code of Work conference. So he was a statistics PhD student, and he was looking at some similar methods. So yeah, so we propose some power transformations. So let alpha be some number greater than 0. So you can sort of transform the data. So you're taking the power of each component, and this transforms the data onto this manifold. So when alpha equals 1, you're still on the simplex, you haven't done anything. But when alpha equals a half, that corresponds to the sum of squares equals 1, so you're on a sphere. And so you can do different powers. And then alpha equals 0, that's if you just take the log of the components. Note that this log transformation is very different to the log ratio method, because Atchison's taking logs of ratios. I'm just taking the log of each component. And this transforms the data onto this curved surface, which is the sum of these exponentials equals 1. So you're on a curve, curved surfaces pretty much. Now, the question is, how can we analyze that data because you're on a curved surface? Yeah, so I'll look at that in a minute. First, you've got to choose what alpha is. So to choose the power parameter, you need to look at the data. So these are box plots of the oxides. So we've got 11-dimensional data. This top left plot corresponds to no transformation. This is the square root transformation on the top right. Bottom left is alpha equals a quarter, and then bottom right, that's just the log. So what you're trying to do when you choose your transformation, you need to get approximate symmetry in the distributions that are close to 0. So alpha equals 1 doesn't really work. Neither does the square root. So you need, because you're trying to make the components more symmetric. So the log transformation looks reasonable here. So we choose the log. So we're on this curved surface. The data's on the curved surface. So how do you analyze that? So the data's on this red surface here. And if you estimate the center of the data, you can approximate that surface with a tangent plane at the center of the data. And that vector is just the normal to that or orthogonal to that surface. And then you can, and analyze the data, you can just project the data from here onto this tangent plane. It's called tangent space in high dimensions. And once you're, and that kind of plane behaves like a standard Euclidean space. So once you're on that, once you've projected the data there, you can effectively just apply PCA based on the normal distribution. So that's what we did in the analysis. And here's what the results look like. So what are we doing here? So you're sort of projecting the data in the direction of highest variability, and then you can also project the data in the direction of second highest variability, a bit like this. So you're calculating these linear transformations, so you can reduce the dimension to 2. So that's what we're plotting. So that's the data plot that we're plotting when you project it in that direction. So that's PC. So that's PC1 versus PC2. And you can also plot the eigenvectors. So remember in, oh, whoops, I'm going the wrong way. So remember in, so these are the eigenvectors, so you can plot those as well, and the transformed data. And so you can plot so the eigenvectors are of dimension 11, they correspond to the oxide. So you can plot those pairs of vectors. And this is sort of what you get. And so you can actually, so for example, Na2O and K2O cluster together, and you can sort of try and interpret that plot. And then you can interpret it in terms of the underlying geology. So this slide is pretty much due to Eric and Patrice, because I'm not a geochemist. So this sort of made sense to them. I think that these underlying geological processes, which they sort of came up with, in some ways, I think it's stating the obvious, but it's good that your data analysis does back that up. Whereas here, if you do the centered log ratio transformation based on what Atchison chose to do, you get a very different result. So you can see here, I've got sort of elliptical contour, like elliptical shape. So my PC1 actually accounts for 80% of the variability. Whereas if you do Atchison's approach, dimension reduction is more difficult because you've got, and then the vectors tend to be sort of almost independent of each other. So PC1 in this case only accounted for 40%. So in some ways, I think my analysis is more interpretable and your dimension reduction was more successful. So you can see you can get very different results depending on what method you apply. Okay, so that's a summary of how I analyze geochemical survey data. So now I'm going to move on to directional statistics. So in 2015, I started collaborating with Andrew Wood at Nottingham. So Andrew was actually a world-leading expert in the statistics of manifold valued data and directional statistics, and he had a big grant from the UK government at the time. I actually met Andrew through Michael Tzagris, because that was one of his PhD students. So that's because I was corresponding with Michael for years, and I eventually visited Nottingham and started talking with Andy. And Andy's actually recently moved to my department here at ANU. So he moved at the beginning of 2020, just in time for COVID, which was in some ways good, I suppose. In any case, we had some ideas for a new distribution and estimation methods for spherical data. So at this point, I thought we've got to find some data. And one of the most obvious places to look is paleomagnetism, because it's one of the most classical examples of spherical data. And I was sort of doing this large literature search. I realized there were some interesting modern geophysics databases. So I was sort of like trying to find data, but some of the papers associated with those databases were sort of hard to understand. So I recognized that I clearly needed help with the geophysics because I didn't understand some of the terminology. So I thought to myself, there's got to be some experts on this at ANU. So I eventually found one of Andrew Roberts' papers and it looked highly relevant. And he then introduced me to David Heslop. Actually, Dave is interesting because he knows quite a lot about statistics. I was very impressed. Yeah, and eventually, so a few years later, I met Lisa, who Lisa talks from the US, and she wrote this book on paleomagnetism, which was extremely helpful to understanding some of the background. And there's actually a long history of ANU statisticians and geophysicists working together, which dates back to Jeff Watson and Ted Irving in the 1950s. And this collaboration was summarized in this paper here, Watson, 1998. So this was in the Canadian Journal of Statistics. And these are the last 3 lines of that paper. When I sent that to Andrew and Dave, Dave was a bit concerned about these couple of sentences. I agree, paleomagnetism is very technical. That's why you need to collaborate and talk with people. And I disagree with what Watson says here. I'm quite excited to continue the tradition and collaborate with geophysicists. Note that Watson wrote this in 1998. So that was at the era before we had modern databases and big data, and there's lots of problems that statisticians could help with, I think. In any case, so let's have a look at paleomagnetic data. So you've got observations on the direction of magnetism in rocks, in archeological specimens. So I guess when rocks or specimens first form, they lock in and record both the intensity of the field and the direction, but the intensity is hard to measure. So in these databases, you've usually only got the directions that are measured. So you've effectively got spherical data. So I'm going to analyze data from these two databases. So the first one contains archeomagnetic data, and we're going to focus on this single location in Germany. The reason why we're going to concentrate on that is because it's got a large amount of modern data in a relatively short time interval, because I'm going to look at ways of modeling that. And then PSV10, that stands for paleosecular variation. So this database contains observations across huge timescales. So, and we're going to look at some equatorial data, because at the equator, geophysicists have noticed that the data seems to be more elliptical if you plot it. So yeah, so we can use the data to explore the variability in the time average field. So what's happening on average over huge timescales? So does GAD hold? Does the geocentric axial dipole assumption hold? So that's basically, does the field behave approximately like a giant bar magnet with two poles? So that's sort of what we're interested in. So in my analysis, I actually, in the database, the directions are given as two angles, D and I. So in my analysis, I just convert these angles into Cartesian coordinates, because that's how I sort of do my analysis. So that's the true field direction. You've got an inclination and a declination angle. Yeah, so it doesn't matter what system you use as long as you're consistent. So this is a plot of in the first database, the angles versus age in years. So you can see there's a large amount of modern data here. So the relationships between the angles and time are quite highly nonlinear. The variability is changing, it's not constant, there's outliers. Here you want to try and predict what the mean field is doing over time. So that's sort of the motivating problem. So how can we model that? And then the data in the second database, I've actually plotted this in Cartesian coordinates. So that's, the coordinate system here is centered at the North Pole. So, so you can see most of the data sort of concentrates here, but then you've got a couple of outliers or values that are sort of far away from the center of the data. So one statistical question we're interested in, can we estimate the mean direction, but we don't want the estimate to be influenced by these outliering points. So that's one of the things we were looking at in our papers. Yeah.
Was that from a single lava flow? What is it called, or is it from multiple lava flows?
I have no idea.
It's multiple.
So multiple lava flows, okay.
But over a restricted time frame?
For those specific sites, I mean, it will have been within the last 10 million. I can't tell you offhand, but they're separate lava flows and separate enough that you assume there's no serial correlation between directions.
Okay. So how can we so what distributions can we use to build models and summarize the data? This is the same slide I had when I was talking about compositional data. So we could use, so historically, both the Fisher distribution and the Kent distribution have been used to summarize paleomagnetic data. So we could apply all this again here. But as I said earlier, this normalizing factor is complicated, C of kappa and beta. So Andrew Wood and I, we thought there's got to be a more tractable distribution that has elliptical shape, where with a less complicated normalizing factor. And so in our paper in 2019, we've introduced this new distribution called the scaled Fisher distribution. Just ignore all those steps there. The important part is here. This is our new probability density, and it's like the Kent, it's got quadratic terms in it. And we've got the same location parameters. We've got a mean direction and a major and minor axis as well. So they're the eigenvectors. So we've got those parameters. We've got a concentration as well, but we've just got different shape parameters. So beta 2 is not the same. So we've got these A parameters. So that's the only big difference. But our normalizing factor is now tractable. We know what it is. So this function here, that's the modified Bessel function of the first kind. And most software packages will be able to calculate that. So that's easy to do. So we can easily estimate the parameters in that model. And if you compare our new distribution with the Kent, we've actually got an extra parameter, A1. If A1 is equal to 1, then you get the same shape as the Kent. But then if A1 is larger, you get a more heavy-tailed distribution, a bit like the T distribution. Yeah, so in a way, our distribution is a bit more flexible. And we actually applied this to Lisa Torks's data generated from her geomagnetic field model, and it appeared to fit the data quite well. So that was our 2019 paper. And I'll show you how simple estimation is. So these are our location parameters. And we can decompose that into the product of these two matrices, where the first is a function of the mean direction, and these Ks are just eigenvectors. So you can combine the Ks and the shape parameters together into a V matrix. And V is effectively a covariance matrix, a bit like what we saw for the normal distribution. So like the normal, we've got a mean, we've got a covariance matrix, and we've got a sort of scale parameter as well. And like the normal, we can actually use sample averages to calculate the mu and the V. So for example, to calculate the mean direction, you just take the sample average and project that back onto the sphere, because it needs to be a unit vector. And then the variance matrix, well, so it's again a sample average, it's weighted. So those weights sort of depend on this scaled Fisher model. But here, so here you're sort of projecting, this is a function of the mean. So you're sort of projecting your data sort of onto the tangent plane. So you're centering it at 0. So that was a bit like what we did for the normal distribution all the way back here. Oops, sorry. You had to center the data there when you calculated V. Well, it's pretty much the same thing. Yeah, so estimation is straightforward. Yeah, so you just use sample averages, and kappa is relatively easy as well. In any case, in our paper, we actually modeled the mean direction in our model as functions of time, and we modeled the variance as a function of time as well. So this is the predicted mean direction from our model, that line there, and that's the data. So here I've plotted the data. So this is Y2 and Y3. So you've got Y1, Y2, and Y3. So that's Euclidean coordinates, and I've centered it roughly at the North Pole. So Y2 and Y3 are sort of what you get when you look down into the tangent plane. And you can see that the variability is increasing. So we've accounted for that in our model by modeling V and kappa as a function of time as well. So it appears to fit the data, and it gives sensible looking results. And then in a more recent paper, we wanted to come up with estimates of the V and the mu, which were sort of more robust to outliers. So remember that data that we had, we didn't like, so if you calculate, if you calculate the sample mean direction, it's going to be pulled in the direction of the outliers. So here we're trying to find a more robust estimator. So you just introduce these weights, and you sort of downweight the observations in the tangent plane, which are far away from the mean direction. So you get so here we've just got some more robust estimators, and then this ellipse here is from our paper. So that's the elliptical confidence region that we computed, sort of based on those robust estimators, and our mean direction is within that interval. And if you calculate the sample mean direction, it's going to be it's actually outside that interval. It's getting pulled in that direction. So that's just a way of robustly estimating the average direction. Yeah, I'm starting to run out of time. I've only got 2 slides left though. This is a paper that's currently under review in a statistics journal. So this is joint work with David Heslop, and Gia Liu is our postdoc. So Gia's actually, so I did a lot of the work on this paper. So Gia's actually working on some other problems that we're hoping to publish in geophysics journals. So in any case, this is an idea. This is like a new statistical analysis method for paleomagnetic data when you take the hierarchical nature of the data into account. Because usually when you go out to sites and collect data, you sample sites first, and then you collect specimens within sites. So the specimens within sites are more similar than specimens between sites. So you've got like clustered data, so it's hierarchical, and you can actually model that. So you can actually define a new model where you're sort of incorporating both specimen level and site level variation into the model. So this is called a mixed effects model, and that's sort of what we did in this paper. And so in that paper, I describe how we can estimate the parameters and calculate these new confidence regions. Yeah, so that's just a rough sum. That's still under review. And then more recently, I've come back to compositional data again. From what I can see, there are 2 unsolved problems, or there's probably a lot more than this, but these are the ones that I've sort of been thinking about. The stoichiometry problem and spatial correlation. So in stoichiometry, minerals obey complicated relationships which are derived from physical laws. And any transformation that you take is going to distort those relationships. So it doesn't matter if you take a log transformation or the square root transformation. So my rough understanding is, because if you react chemical A with chemical B to create chemical C, that's a linear process. So you're trying to uncover some of these processes, but how can you do that on the transform scale? So that's a problem. And then spatial correlation. So I've completely ignored the fact that when I analysed that geochemical data from Australia, that the sites that are close to each other are more similar than sites further away. So there's a strong spatial signal in that data. So, but I think that explains much of the skewness I've come to realise. So I think you may be able to avoid transforming the geochemical data if you take the spatial correlation properly into account. So I'm sort of working on ways of doing that. And lastly, and then if you do that, that's going to help with stoichiometry, hopefully, because you're not transforming the data. And this is a recent paper which is in revision at the moment, where I've defined a new distribution on the simplex. This is for compositional data. And I've defined it directly on the simplex, so you don't need to take any transformations. You'll notice that there's a complicated normalizing factor in this model. So remember I said that was a problem for the Kent distribution. It also had a complicated normalizing factor. But the interesting thing here is there's this new estimation method which is in the machine learning literature, and it's based on score matching. If you use that estimation procedure, you don't need to evaluate this. So you can actually get estimates of the parameters in the model quite easily, actually, and they have good properties. So that's a bit about my recent work. And then if you want more details, so these are the papers which I've sort of discussed here today, and then there's some further references that I've referenced. So yeah, so that'll be it, just in time.
Thank you very much. Why don't we try questions from the room, if there are any more, and anybody who's online who wants to ask questions could raise their hands and we'll sort out how to unmute things. But first of all, let's see if everybody has a good question. Thanks for the very interesting talk. Thanks for the very interesting talk.
So I was wondering about what the sort of maximum dimensionality in these sorts of compositional problems you think these methods can be pushed at. Because if I was doing something like a finite fault inference problem, I want to distribute my total silent moment over, say, 10,000 bins, and that would be potentially a syntax type problem if I had control on the total moment that I was distributing. Is that something that can feasibly be done with these sorts of methods?
Yeah, I think so. Well, there's a field of statistics called high dimensional statistics, which might help with that as well. So they've got sort of smart ways of doing estimation when you've got a huge number of variables. Yeah. So, and some of these methods can be applied, but you might have to sort of tweak things a little bit. But yeah, I'm sure I think that's possible.
I just had a question about the Lava data. And you downloaded the outliers, but I mean, is it sort of reasonable to ignore the fact that all the outliers are pulling you in the same direction?
Yeah, it's maybe is that like it's going towards a reversal or something, maybe. I don't know.
It's difficult to put a physical interpretation
Yeah.
on what's going on there, but it seems like, you know, if it was just a random
Yeah.
noise, then the distribution would be random, it would be systematic, but instead
yeah.
all those outliers are going in the same direction.
Yeah.
Just wondering, you know, I don't know why.
Normally excursional or directions heading towards the other polarity. So I don't know what they I haven't read what they do. I don't know what their basis for including and excluding data were. But good point.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Just a quick question. You showed the line plots. I think give an example of the effect of power transformation or something like that.
Yeah.
And there was quite a difference. But the data that were analysed the sort of traditional way, they were quite spread out, whereas when you did it your way, you had these three clear groupings.
Yeah.
But what about even if you did it in a traditional, if you tried it on a sample, say, where even doing it traditional way, you've got clear groupings, because I have an example of that with my data, and I'm thinking, oh, would it make any difference if I did it your way? Or is it only when you're not seeing it?
Well, if you don't transform, you're on the simplex, so you're on a hyperplane. You could actually just apply standard PCA to that, and that's reasonable.
Yeah.
But I guess the problem is it might be hard to interpret if let's go back here. If you've got highly skewed data though, then it might kind of because you're trying to transform it so it looks more normal, like so you can deal with that. So, but that if your data's not too skewed, that's reasonable.
Yeah, it's already.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is the data's
So you don't have to transform it. No, you can just interpret that. Yeah.
So I have a question from online that I can read out for you. From Gareth Davis. It says, this sounds very interesting to define distributions on the manifold directly, what you were discussing at the end. Do you think that it's likely to be an overall more promising approach for all these kinds of problems?
Yes. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I think so. And it's more interpretable too, because you know, with the log ratio, you're taking ratios of multiple components. Here, like each of these components relate to the original one. I think it's more interpretable. Yeah.
Okay. Does that answer the question?
I don't know.
Yeah, I think we're coming to an end.
Oh, we haven't.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
So if I'd like to apply that, is there like an R package I can just download and run this, or
I've got R code I can send you. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you everyone. We had a lot of people online. We had 40 plus people coming in from all over the place. That's great. There is more room in the room, people. That's nice to have that as well. But let's just say thank you very much. And there will be applause from online to hear that. So we'll just do that from the room. Thank you very much.